Greetings and God bless you in the name of Jesus Christ. Thank you for joining this Bible study today. Our topic is toxic masculinity. By way of an introduction, 1 John 4:1 says that we should try the spirits and see whether they are of God. That's an admonition to all Christians that we should look a little deeper than just the superficial aspects of things and see what spirit things are of. And today, especially, as much as ever before, we need to understand the spirit, what is behind things. Because it's not just enough to take things at what they claim to be or at their presentation level or at a superficial level. We have to dig a little deeper and see what the motive and the spirit is behind things. And so today we have all these different factions and movements and organizations, and a lot of them are really just the same spirit. So whether they call themselves politically correct or woke or postmodern or gender identity or feminist or cancel culture or whatever other label, really they're all just the same spirit doing the same job for the same master that they're all working for. Today we're specifically going to talk about just one of these things, which is toxic masculinity. What is that? What does it even mean? This is a definition that I got from thegoodmenproject.com. Toxic masculinity is a narrow and repressive description of manhood, designated manhood as defined by violence, sex, status, and aggression. It also says that in other places, toxic masculinity is one of the ways in which patriarchy is harmful to men. It refers to the socially constructed attitudes that describe the masculine gender role as violent, unemotional, sexually aggressive, and so forth. The pervasive idea of male interactions with females as competition and not cooperation is another way that toxic masculinity is defined. I found this a little humorous, but there are some words in the German language that make fun of what we in America would call a wimp. The first one is Schattenparker, which means one who parks their car in the shadow. Another one is Schackenschlafer, which means sleeps with your socks on. And then there's Handschuh Schneeballwerfer, if I said that right, which is wears gloves when making snowballs. And then there's Warmduscher, which means uses warm water when showering. And Frauenversteher, which means understands women. So these are some German words poking fun at men that don't portray themselves as particularly masculine. And then there's another phrase called hegemonic masculinity, which is taught under gender studies, which used to be called women's studies. There was a man named R.W. Connell, and this is part of his theory. It's defined as a practice that legitimizes powerful men's dominant position in society. So these things are somewhat of a definition, but to me, it's still not 100% clear what they're talking about. So here are three basic aspects of what they're talking about. Suppressing emotions or masking distress. Real men don't cry would be a way that would be expressed. Or suck it up would be another thing that people would say. Maintaining an appearance of hardness and toughness. Using violence as a means to gain power over others. According to the American Psychology Association, it's these cultural lessons that have linked to aggression and violence. They're blaming those things on what they call toxic masculinity. This term was coined by Shepard Bliss. And when it was first invented, it was not very popular and a lot of people didn't know about it. But over the several decades since it's been invented, it's become quite a popular word. In fact, the Oxford Dictionary's 2018 word of the year was toxic. Google searches for toxic masculinity have climbed steadily since May of 2016. Over 90,000 news articles and 150,000 videos and climbing are indexed on Google through this term, toxic masculinity. That's how pervasive it is now. And here's another sentence that I gleaned from Joseph Vandello, a social psychologist. He says that the idea that manhood is something that has to be earned is fairly widespread. Now, obviously, he means this in a negative context. I don't have a problem with that, to be honest with you. I think there are certain rites of passage and benchmarks and milestones that boys and young men should strive to hit to indicate that they're growing in their maturity and their manhood. Manhood is adulthood. So do we have a problem with saying that there are certain things that would indicate that somebody's growing into adulthood? So what's the difference if we're saying that these are things that would indicate that somebody is earning their manhood? I don't have a problem with that. It's been that way all throughout history, but now all of a sudden in the 21st century, it's the reason for all of society's evils, according to some people. So let's look at what the Bible defines, because we don't want to just base our definitions of things on what culture and society and even what the alleged experts are saying. The Bible is our first source of information, and it's our final authority over everything. So let's look at a few words in the Bible and see how they're defined. The word male in the Bible in Genesis 1:27 is the word zakar, which means surprising, a male. Unfortunately, that's how confused people are today, that a simple definition like that does not satisfy some people. It has to be a lot more complicated and a lot more confusing than that, and there's a reason for that. And then it says, him, male, manned, as he through the memorial of parents is continued. Like, for example, the way we do today, that the last name is passed down from the man side. And then it also says, it's used to signify the membrum virile. And I'm not trying to be vulgar, but that's what the word means. And then there's the word female, also in Genesis 1:27. It's the Hebrew word nekabah. It means a woman, a female. And again, I'm not trying to be vulgar. This is the lexicon's definition of the word. A genitalia figura dicta, that's Latin for obviously a female's private parts. And the root word is nakab, which means to pierce, perforate, or a hole. In Genesis 1:28, the very next verse, it tells this male and this female to be fruitful and multiply. And then in Genesis 2:22, we see the words man and woman. The word man is the word Adam, which means red or red clay. And it can refer to mankind, not just the male half of humankind. And then there's the word woman, which is Isha, which is wife or woman. Notice how simple these definitions are and how vivid they are and how they point to biology and not some other vague, changeable criteria. Now here's Webster's dictionary, and it says gender is a subclass within a grammatical class, and it goes on to describe grammatical rules, like a male word that would end with an O and a female word that would end with an A. And it's talking about the grammatical aspect of gender. But as far as what we're talking about today, it says the behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits typically associated with one sex. And then Webster defines the word sex as either of the two major forms of individuals that occur in many species and that are distinguished respectively as female or male, especially on the basis of their reproductive organs and structures. So there we go again, a very simple, clear-cut, easy to understand definition that's tied to biology. And it also says the sum of the structural, functional, and behavioral characteristics of organisms that are involved in reproduction, marked by the union of gametes that distinguish males and females. And notice again, all of these definitions so far only include two options, male and female. Now here's dictionary.com, just for a third reference. Gender means either the male or female division of a species, especially as differentiated by social and cultural roles and behavior, i.e. the feminine gender. And then there's also gender and language, as Webster also defines. And then dictionary.com defines sex as either the male or female division of a species, especially as differentiated with reference to the reproductive functions, and the sum of the structural and functional differences by which the male and female are distinguished, or the phenomena or behavior dependent on these differences. These are the definitions of male and female and man and woman that have been around for thousands of years all over the world through all different cultures, and it's been very consistent. It's only recently that we've had a lot of confusion regarding the definitions of words, and it's not a coincidence. If you look at communism and fascism and socialism in the 20th century, we will see illustrated the tactic of these types of organizations of manipulating and changing language to fit their agenda. We see a book like George Orwell's 1984, which very clearly illustrates the government's use of the manipulation of language and the definitions of words in order to propagate their agenda. And that is exactly what's going on in the world today. I'm not here to talk about politics. I'm here to talk about the spiritual aspects of things, but sometimes they overlap. So what we would call the left is famous for using this tactic of changing definitions, inventing new words, creating confusion in language to promote their agenda and to dilute the simple truth that has been prevalent throughout the world from the beginning of time. In Canada, they passed a bill, C-16, in 2017, and since then, 32 other countries have followed suit. And it makes certain words, or the refusal to use certain words, a hate crime and hate speech, and even, according to some people, an act of violence. That's how far we've gone with this. This specifically relates to the use of gender pronouns, and now people are continually inventing new pronouns for themselves to describe who they are for that 15 minutes, and then they could just change their pronouns. And they say that the list of pronouns cannot be confined. It is infinite. Okay, well, there's a real practical problem with that. There are 7 billion people in the world, and if they each can use multiple pronouns and change them at any given time, how many billions of pronouns are we supposed to know? And how are we supposed to know when they've been changed? And especially if we're going to be charged with a hate crime and thrown in prison for failure to use the correct pronoun, this is a bunch of gobbledygook that has nothing to do with common sense or reality. It's just a manner of promoting a confusing, divisive agenda that has nothing to do with truth or reality. Now they're changing laws to try to accommodate this mindset. And I ask you, what is the point of a birth certificate or an ID if it doesn't identify the person? That's the whole point of having an identification. If it doesn't clearly identify who the person is, then what is the point of having an ID? But that's where we're at now. Now, here is what is repeatedly cited as supporting evidence of toxic masculinity. First one is the rape culture. First, I would like to point out that the definition of rape can be severely diluted by those who are alleging that toxic masculinity has produced a rape culture. For example, one of their definitions of rape is if a man and a woman are on third base, as they used to say, and all of a sudden the woman decides she wants to call timeout, and the man wants to continue, and without using physical force, he just insists that they continue, and so she agrees. That's considered a rape to some people. According to the FBI, only 1 out of 1,900 women has been raped, not 1 in 4, as the rape culture proponents have put forth. And then they say, well, on campus, it's 1 out of 4. Well, according to the Department of Justice, the statistics from 1996 to 2002 say, no, it's only 6 per 1,000. And I'm not condoning rape. Any one single rape should not be happening. But it should be an actual rape, not what's falsely defined as a rape. And what about the false accusers of rape? Does anyone remember the Duke lacrosse team being falsely accused of rape? So they were dragged through the mud and tarnished. And then what happened to the accusers? As usual, nothing happens to the accusers. In Exodus 20:16 and Deuteronomy 19:16 to 21, the law of Moses says that if you falsely accuse somebody, and then after the investigation, it's found that you were falsely accusing the person, whatever would have been done to them as a punishment for their crime will be done to you to teach you and society not to be false accusers. But today, people perjure themselves every single day, and nothing ever happens to them. And there's no restitution made to the person whose life has been damaged or destroyed because of these false allegations. That's wrong. That's a crime. How about pay inequality? That's another famous one that just recently was trumpeted again. But let's look at the facts. In 1963, discriminating in pay based on sex was federally made against the law. And guess who voted that law in and who signed that law in? It was white men. The patriarchy, the people responsible for all the evils in the world were the ones who made this law. So it's been against the law for women to be discriminated in pay since 1963. This is nothing new. So why do women supposedly make less than men? Well, by and large, they don't. But in some instances where they're able to find somewhat of a discrepancy, there are usually these explanations for it. The college major choices that women make over what men make. The engineering field is predominantly fielded by men. In fact, my son, who was in engineering school in college, had an entire session presented by a woman bemoaning the fact that they need more women in engineering school. Like my son was supposed to go out and recruit women into his class or something. I don't know what they expected him to do. What kind of career choices do women make, and college major choices, which they go hand in hand, do women make? They usually choose to go into careers that make less money. So maybe that's one of the reasons that they make less money. A college is sold as a path to better jobs, making more money. But more women than men go to college, and more women than men graduate college. So why aren't they making more money? Because of the patriarchy? Well, if the patriarchs are running all the businesses, according to the feminists, then why don't the patriarchs hire all women and pay them less, and then they can make more money in their business? That's not what's happening. Also, women take time off to have and raise children, so their net income goes down. 8% of women make more in 147 out of 150 of the biggest cities in the US, according to Time magazine. And then the hours worked for the type of job chosen also can affect your income. So men tend to go into jobs that work longer hours. And so when you work more hours at the same pay, you're going to make more money. Now here's an example that I alluded to just a moment ago. The 2021 U.S. women's soccer team not all of them, but some of them were protesting the patriarchy and unfair pay for women. And they signed up voluntarily to represent the United States at the Olympics, and then they protested their own country at the Olympics. And here's the truth behind what really happened. The men's team negotiated a contract with the United States, and they agreed to only get paid and to have no benefits like health insurance because they already had those benefits. So they would rather get paid more and not have the benefits included in their contract. The women's team was offered the exact same contract and officially refused it. They wanted the benefits, and they got the benefits. Now, the way the contracts are structured is the further in the playoffs you go, the more money you make. You get paid X amount to make it past the first round, then you get paid X amount to get past the second round, then you get X amount to play in the finals and so on. Well, the women's team actually went further than the men's team did, and so between their pay and their benefits, they actually made more than the men's team did. So what are they protesting? The American Psychological Association says, quote, men are overrepresented in prisons, are more likely than women to commit violent crimes, and are at greater risk of being a victim of violent crime. So that's an area where women actually have the advantage. How about people that practice sodomy? They usually make more money because they don't have to support a family. They have more degrees, and they have a higher rate of violence and suicide in their community. Now, why is that? How is that the patriarchy's fault? Author Rollo Tomasi tweeted, children from single-parent households, overwhelmingly single mothers, account for 80% of rapists motivated by displaced anger. Congratulations, feminism. You've literally bred and raised the rape culture you claim to fear, unquote. Somebody named Mr. replied, 43% of boys are raised by single mothers. 78% of teachers are female. So almost 50% of boys have 100% feminine influence while at home, and an 8 to 10 chance of 100% influence at school. Toxic masculinity isn't the problem. Lack of masculinity is, unquote. And then they complain about sexual objectivism. Now, I would ask you, are movie stars and TV stars and models compelled by force to go into those careers, or do they choose those careers because of the opportunity to make a lot of money? It's voluntary. Nobody forced them into those careers. So it's not forced on women by men. According to fatherly.com, these are some of the alleged harmful effects of the patriarchy, the toxic masculinity: suppressed emotion, encouraged violence, discouragement of seeking help, the rape culture, homophobia, misogyny. We mentioned previously the subject of gender studies. Let's look a little closer at that. There are three main people that are considered the founders of gender studies. Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote The Second Sex in 1949. John Money, who in the 1950s to 60s redefined gender and separated the definition of gender from sex. And you notice in those dictionary definitions that I read, you see that there's one definition that makes them the same, and then there's another definition that separates them. That's a relatively new thing. I remember when gender and sex meant the exact same thing. When a baby was born and they would ask, what is the gender or what is the sex? It meant the exact same thing. This man, John Money, was the co-editor of a 1969 book called Transsexualism and Sex Reassignment, and he conducted an infamous study, and I say infamous even though it's still quoted as a great founding study for these issues. He took two twin boys And what's often not reported is they were subject to body mutilation, perversion, and abuse. And David Reamer, who was reassigned the identity of Brenda, started living as a boy at 15 and later committed suicide, and his twin brother OD'd. So the results of this study are not good. They do not provide a solid foundation for this whole transgender issue, gender identity issue that's being pushed so heavily today. Then there was Judith Butler, a professor at UC Berkeley. She wrote Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity in 1990, and Bodies That Matter on the Discursive Limits of Sex in 1993. Just to show you the questionableness of the research that's been done, several groups got together and wrote hoaxes on gender studies, and they were purposefully mocking gender studies and the research that they do, and yet these articles got peer-reviewed and published as authoritative research articles on the subject. That's how weak the research really is on this. Now we have something called Welcoming Schools, sponsored by the Human Rights Campaign, the U.S.'s largest LGBT lobbying organization, with books like Jacob's New Dress and It's Perfectly Normal, teaching kids as young as kindergarten to be confused about their identity and what gender and sex they are. Now let me point out that there's a difference between femininity and feminism. Webster's dictionary defines feminine as characteristic of, or appropriate, or unique to women. It defines feminism as the theory of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. Organized activity on behalf of women's rights and interests. So there are two very stark differences in this definition. Femininity has to do with accentuating the things that make femininity beautiful, what makes women a valuable part of society. Feminism has to do with making men and women equal and trying to erase the differences. Femininity is a beautiful thing. Feminism is about asserting rights. If feminists hate men so much, why are they trying to become so much like them and take on their roles? That's contradictory, isn't it? Or are they just rejecting their God-given role as women and trying to blur the difference and actually take on male roles because they're not happy with who they are? The Bible, which they blame for the patriarchy and the toxic masculinity that supposedly pervades society, is not a book of chauvinism. It's not a book of oppression of women. It honors women more than any other religion or any other religious text. Let's look at marriage and divorce in the Bible. In Genesis 2:20-25, marriage is the first human relationship, the first institution for man created by God. In Deuteronomy 22:13-19, if a man falsely accused his wife of not being a virgin when they got married, he would pay her father 100 shekels of silver, which was a lot of money, and never was he allowed to divorce his wife. Later on in the same chapter, if a man lies with a virgin, he pays 50 shekels of silver. He has to marry the girl, and he is never allowed to divorce her. In Deuteronomy 4:1-2, a divorced woman was free. So if a man rejected his wife, she was free. Deuteronomy 24:5 says that newlyweds were off the first year of their marriage. They had no responsibilities, just to enjoy their marriage and build up their marriage relationship. In Hosea verses 1-3, we see God tell the prophet Hosea to marry a prostitute because God knew she would be unfaithful to her husband. And God was using Hosea as an illustration of his relationship with the nation of Israel, because their idolatry was like spiritual adultery. And then after she went away from him, God told Hosea to go find her and to bring her back to himself and to forgive her and to restore the marriage, just like God forgives and restores the sinners that stray away from him. In Malachi 2:10-16, it says that God hates divorce. Now, it doesn't say that God hates divorced people, but that God hates divorce because he hates the damage that it does to men and women and children and society. God knows the damage that divorce creates, and that's why he hates it. And it also says that when there's marital problems, that our prayers will be hindered. And this is also said in 1 Peter 3:7. So God highly upholds the value of marriage, half of which is women. Jesus said in Matthew 5:31-32 that except for adultery, there should be no divorce. In Matthew 19:3-9, they asked Jesus why Moses allowed for divorce if he says that we shouldn't get divorced. And he says it was because of the hardness of your heart. But in the beginning, it was not so. God did not ordain divorce. God does not desire divorce. He wants women to be blessed by being in healthy marriages with strong Christian men that are going to love their wife and take care of them. In Ephesians 5:22-33, it says that a marital relationship is a representation of the relationship between Christ and the church. That's how highly God values marriage. And in 1 Peter 3:7, it says that husbands should honor their wives. Rape was forbidden in the law of Moses and in the New Testament. Incest was forbidden in the law of Moses. Mothers are to be highly honored in the Bible. One of the 10 commandments is to honor your mother. Jesus quoted this twice in Matthew 15 and Matthew 19, and Ephesians 6:2 quotes this and says that it's the first commandment with promise. In Exodus 21:15, if you hate your mother, you were to be put to death under the law of Moses. And then 2 verses later, if you curse your mother, you're to be put to death. A stubborn son was to be put to death. Proverbs 23:22 says not to despise your mother. Proverbs 28:24 says if you rob your mother, you're a companion of a destroyer. Galatians 3:28 says there is neither male nor female, but all are one in Christ. That means that when it comes to salvation, men and women have no advantage one over the other. All are equal at the foot of the cross of Jesus. There were many women of honor in the Bible. Eve, Rahab, Deborah, Ruth, the widow woman that Elijah was sent to, Elisha's friend, Huldah the prophetess, Esther the queen, Mary the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, the first to see Jesus when he rose from the dead, and many others. God created women. In Isaiah 66:13, God says, as a mother will I comfort you. And in Matthew 23:37, Jesus said that as a hen gathers his chicks under her wings, he wanted to be like that to the nation of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. So God doesn't hate women, and God doesn't teach men to hate women. But it seems like there's an awful lot of man-hating going on in the feminism movement today. Just to show you how ridiculous it's gotten, there's now something called manspreading that women are rallying against. It's banned in Madrid. You can go on YouTube and see videos of a Russian feminist going around in public transportation and pouring bleach in men's laps that are supposedly manspreading. Manspreading is simply men sitting with their legs apart, as opposed to women who are taught to sit with their legs together so they could be modest. Steven Crowder did an experiment where he created a device that simulates for women what it's like to have the anatomy of a man, and so they can experience what it's like to try to sit with your legs squeezed together when you're a man. And they all understood that they're not just trying to be jerks or chauvinist or patriarchal or toxically masculine, that it's just because of their nature and the way their body is. On November 29th, 2017, Psychology Today published an article asking, how about toxic feminism? Have we swung to the other extreme? And it's part of this whole painting with broad strokes, trying to group people together in a hypocritical tactic where they're claiming to try to honor the individual, but really they're the ones grouping people together and being divisive. How about facts versus emotions? Who is angry and just spewing violence, as they call it, and hatred and divisiveness? Is it the patriarchy? No, it's the feminists. Look at the videos on YouTube of them screaming and yelling. And when somebody tries to calmly cite facts to them that dispute their viewpoint, they just get even angrier and yell even louder. We need to have facts over emotions. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have any emotions at all or express emotions at any time. But when your emotions are running your life instead of the truth, you are out of balance. Now let's look at male privilege. Another example of the patriarchy, the Judeo-Christian oppression, the Western culture holding women down. We talked about pay inequality already. Did you know that 94% of workplace deaths are men? 90% of inmates in prison are men. And some people say, well, that's because they're the criminals. But men do 63% more for the same offense as women. How is that fair? How about victims of crime? 76% of homicide victims are men. Homicide is always in the top 10 reasons that men die and never in the top 10 for women. 4 out of 5 suicides are men. And it's always in the top 10 reason men die, never in the top 10 reason women die. How about war? In the Korean War, 99.9% of the deaths were men. In the Vietnam War, 99.9%. And you would say, well, now women are allowed to participate in this, so the number should have skyrocketed, right? Nope. In the Gulf War, it was 95%. In Enduring Freedom, it was 98%. And in Iraqi freedom, it was 98%. Homelessness is largely a male problem. Drug abuse is largely a male problem. And now that women are asserting their rights and gaining access to things that used to be predominantly male, it's backfiring, and they're paying the price for it. They're getting distress that men used to have. They're getting the medical issues that men used to have. A heart attack was once a man's disease. It is now the #1 killer of women. It's the #1 killer for both sexes, but now more for women than for men. In 1971, 419,716 men died of a heart attack, 323,652 women. It's remained mostly steady for men from then all the way till 1998. But in that same period, every year it increased for women, and women passed men in 1991. These are stats from the CDC, the NCHS, and the Bureau of Vital Statistics. Now, what happened in that same time period? Women, more and more, got involved in what were traditionally men's roles. And so now they're experiencing the medical side effects of being in those roles. How about women's suffrage as an example? Most women did not want the right to vote because back then the draft was tied directly to the right to vote. And who approved and got into law suffrage or women's right to vote? It was white men in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified. So if white men were so busy trying to hold women down, why did they pass the 19th Amendment? Single motherhood. is another topic we need to examine. According to the Brookings Institute, there are 3 things that you need to avoid in order to avoid poverty. Get married before you have kids, graduate high school, and get a job. 75% of people that do these 3 things move from poverty to the middle class. And did you know that 90% of the United States is above the global standard of poverty, and only 2% of the US is poor compared to global standards, according to Pew Research? 71% of the poor live in a single mother household. And it's not a racial thing either, because 22% of white single moms are poor, and 7% of black married couples are poor. So marriage has a much bigger factor on poverty than does race. 54% of the electorate is women. So why don't they elect other women if they feel that that's such a big issue? How about the policy of women and children first, which still exists today as it should? Remember when Captain Sully crash landed his plane in the river after the engines failed? They got the women and the children off the plane first. And that's a good thing. I'm not against that or complaining about it, but I'm just showing you that there are policies that favor women today that we don't talk about very much. And men have traditional roles too. So it's not just women that are being forced into these traditional roles that are supposedly oppressing them. Men also have traditional roles, and they should. It's not a problem for men to be normal men and women to be normal women. There are numerous studies when they take toddlers who haven't been crammed into these roles yet, supposedly, and they're given toys that are traditionally girl toys and traditionally boy toys, and even when there's an attempt to coerce the children to embrace the toys that are traditionally the other sexes, they go to their own toys. The boys get the trucks, the girls get the dolls, because that's how we're wired. We are biologically different. Our natures are different. We're created by God different. I didn't say one better than the other. I said different. How about men dying earlier than women do? Women on average live 5 years longer than men. How about domestic violence? Well, this is part of the toxic masculinity, right? This is part of the violence that men perpetrate on women. Did you know that many men don't report when they're domestically abused by their female partner? Why? Because they're ashamed. Because they won't be believed, and because guess what happens when they call the police? They get arrested, even though they're the victim. According to the CDC, in 2014, there were more men than women that were victims of domestic violence. But they still use the Duluth power and control wheel to determine what happened in the family and what decisions they should make. That Duluth power wheel was written and devised when it was women that were considered to be the only victims of domestic violence. It's skewed towards women getting all the attention. When's the last time you saw a men's shelter? They're all for women. How about orders of protection? The man loses the house, he loses his job, his kids, and all of his belongings simply by the woman going into court without him even being there to defend himself and making an allegation, and an order of protection is issued against the man. It's almost never the other way around. I worked in the court system for 28 years. I know what I saw every single day for 28 years. And I worked for 6 years in the unit that served the orders of protection. So I know from personal experience what I'm talking about. I used to have to sit in monthly meetings regarding orders of protection and domestic violence. So I do have some experience on this. When's the last time you heard of a woman being charged with perjury for lying about a man in court? When's the last time you heard about the damage being reversed that the man suffered by being kicked out of his job, not being able to go places, not being able to see his children? Were there any repercussions for those lies? Absolutely not. Here's another example. Does anybody remember Boko Haram, the Nigerian terrorist group, who in 2014 made international news because of the outrage of them kidnapping 276 girls and all the international pressure and attention that was brought down upon them because of that? And it should have been. But what was never mentioned once was before that, they killed 6,000 boys. There was no media attention for that whatsoever. But when the girls got kidnapped, everybody was screaming and yelling. In family court, 80% of the women get the kids. Women can adopt out their children without the man's input at all. And women lie about who the father is. And now we have to have DNA tests because there was so much lying going on in court that now they have to submit a genetic sample to see if they're really the father or not before they start making all these demands on the men and finding out that they're not even the father in the first place. Because, in case you never noticed, people lie. How about abortion? When's the last time you heard of Planned Parenthood stopping a woman from getting an abortion because they wanted to bring the father in to see if he was in agreement that this child should be aborted? That never happens. Who's running around drugged up on Ritalin? Girls? No, it's boys. When did you hear about the big issue about girls' behavior in school and let's put them on drugs? That never happens. It's only the boys. Men and women have equal value in the sight of God, but they do not have equal roles. God assigned different roles to men and women. And this effort today to blur and to erase those roles is not of God, and it's leading to the destruction of society. There are biological differences between men and women. Our brains are different. They're wired different. They're structurally different, and they function different. Our hormones are different, and obviously our biology is different. God wants us to have equal opportunities, but not equal outcomes, because it all depends on many factors. We can't just automatically guarantee across the board equal outcomes for everyone, regardless of any other factors. That is not scriptural, and it's not practical, and it just doesn't work. For those that say this toxic masculinity is the Bible's fault, let's look at a few scriptures that talk about the relationships between men and women in marriage and what they're supposed to be like. Ephesians 5, 22 to 33, Colossians 3, 18 to 19, Titus 2, 1 to 8, and 1 Peter 3, 1 to 7. Just to boil them down in a simplistic summary, they say that husbands should love their wives and lay down their lives for them like Christ laid down his life for the church, and that wives should respect their husbands. Obviously, if we conducted a Christian marriage seminar, there would be a lot more to say than just that one sentence. But that's really it in a nutshell. Husbands, love your wives. Wives, respect your husbands. There is a irreplaceable and intrinsic value to men and the contribution that they should be making to marriage and children and society and to women in general. In the Bible, one man had incredible initial impact on so many things that happened in the Bible. Adam, the first man. Noah, the man who built the ark and saved humanity through his obedience to God. Abraham, the founder of the nation of Israel. Moses, the writer of the law. David. Jesus, the founder of the New Testament church. Peter, Paul, and many other great men in the Bible that show us that men are not toxic to women and they're not toxic to society. Now, you don't have to be a Superman. You don't have to rise to the tremendous level of influence and legacy that these men in the Bible had, but really, you just have to be there and do your job. Let me show you some examples of the difference between a father being there and a father not being there. 63% of youth suicides come from a fatherless home. That means that kids in a fatherless home are 5 times more likely to commit suicide than those who the father is present. 90% of the homeless and runaways come from fatherless homes. That means they're 32 times more likely. 85% of child behavior disorders are 20 times more likely. 71% of dropouts, 9 times more likely. 75% of chemical abuse centers, teens, 10 times more likely. 70% of juveniles in detention centers, 9 times more likely. They're 20 times more likely to end up in prison. 53% of children are born out of wedlock now. 92% of children not in poverty have both parents. 40% of children in poverty are because of the fact that they only have one parent. 83% of single parents are poor women. Children that have both parents are 50% less likely to be depressed and 50% less likely to use drugs just because they eat dinner with their parents. Just that one simple thing of dad and mom and the kids sitting down and eating dinner together reduces their likelihood of using drugs by 15%. That is, if any other of these social programs and these organizations out there had a 15% improvement in anything, they would be trumpeting that all over the world. Fatherlessness is damaging, and a father just being present alone, besides doing a great job, makes a difference. Here are some examples throughout history where just one vote changed the outcome. In 1645, one vote gave Oliver Cromwell control of England. In 1649, one vote caused Charles I of England to be executed. You could be sure that one vote mattered to him. In 1776, one vote gave America the English language instead of German. In 1839, one vote elected Marcus Morton, the governor of Massachusetts. In 1845, one vote brought Texas into the Union. In 1868, one vote saved President Andrew Johnson from conviction on impeachment. In 1875, one vote changed France from monarchy to a republic. In 1876, one vote elected Rutherford B. Hayes president. In 1920, one vote gave Tennessee ratification of the 19th Amendment. In 1923, one vote gave Adolf Hitler leadership of the Nazi Party. In 1941, one vote saved selective service weeks before Pearl Harbor was attacked. In 1976, one vote derailed H.R. 11193 and saved America from a handgun ban. Both men and women have pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, good and bad. The Bible does not teach a victimhood mentality or division. It's not us versus them. We're in this together. Don't be hypocrites, but be balanced. So what's the number one definition of manhood? I would summarize it all in one word, which is responsibility. In Genesis 2 and 3, we see man told to dress and keep the garden. And then after the curse, because of sin, God telling Adam that the ground was cursed for his sake, and it was from that time forward bring forth thorns and thistles, and he would have to labor in the sweat of his brow until he returned to the dust from whence he came. Now, some people mistakenly say that this means that God cursed Adam to have to work. Adam already was supposed to work. The difference was that his work would become fruitless. Instead of producing abundant, life-giving, nutritious food, it would bring forth thorns and thistles. It was fruitless labor that was the curse, not just labor within itself. So man should not look at his need to work as a curse. It's a blessing. The book of Ecclesiastes says several times that fruitless work is a curse. It's a vanity. It's a vexation upon man, that he would work and not get to enjoy the fruit of his labor. Taking responsibility for your own actions is a biblical principle. See Titus 1:6. What we call adult behavior today, drinking alcohol, smoking tobacco, viewing pornography, using foul language, gambling, fornicating, being violent, etc., etc. Those are not adult behaviors. Those are irresponsible behaviors. Being responsible is adult behavior. So what should men do to be responsible? They should take charge. I don't mean be bullies and domineer. They should take charge of their self first. Proverbs 16:32 says, if a man doesn't rule his own spirit, he's like a city whose walls are broken down. A man should take charge of his family. 1 Timothy 3:4-5. He should take charge of others in being a leader. Don't be dependent on others, but be dependent upon yourself. 2 Thessalonians 3:6-14 and 1 Timothy 5:8. To work for a living, support yourself, support your family, and don't be dependent. Don't be a wimp. Don't be one of those German words. Face your problems. Don't run away. Remember, wherever you go, you're there. David was a man of tremendous courage and faith, and I don't compare myself to David, but even David found himself running away in 1 Samuel 27, verse 1, when Saul finally admitted that David was right and he was wrong, and David was going to be the next king, and that he would no longer pursue David, David said, there's nothing left for me to do but run away to the Philistines. Elijah had the same problem. After he had done his great victory on top of Mount Carmel and prayed the fire down from heaven and turned the Israelites back to God and destroyed the prophets of Baal, the very next day, we see him fleeing from a threat made by Jezebel, the queen, and running all the way to the Sinai Peninsula on foot in fear for his life. And in both instances, both men eventually had to turn around and come back and face their circumstances. We have to take a stand. Ephesians 6:10-18 says to stand, not to run away. We have to be a man of God. A classic example of this is in 1 Samuel 4, verse 9, when the Israelites were fighting against the Philistines in battle, and they went and had the Ark of the Covenant taken out of the tabernacle and brought out to the battlefield, and the Philistines became fearful and said, this is the God that parted the Red Sea for Israel and did all these great things for them. Who can stand before this God? And somebody in that Philistine army stood up and said, be strong and quit yourselves like men so we don't have to be servants to the Israelites. And the Philistines were encouraged and fought and won the battle, even against the people of God, when they were willing to take a stand. And then there was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, who stood against the Philistines and defended a simple piece of land that wasn't worth all that much, but he just decided, I'm sick and tired of being pushed around and dominated. I'm going to take a stand and fight for what's mine. And God gave him the victory that day. Be an instrument in the hands of God. Let God use you as an instrument in his kingdom. Don't just be a immobile bystander. Don't just be a seat warmer. Get up and do something for the kingdom of God and be a man of God. And then last of all, realize that you're not an island. Men are guilty of isolating themselves too much and not participating in the community of believers, especially their fellow men, when there's a tremendous source of strength in the fellowship of men in the church that we need to draw from and be part of. So masculinity is not the problem. And I'm not saying that all men are perfect and that everything is all right with men and women are the problem. That is not what I'm saying at all. Men have issues, women have issues. Men have strengths, women have strengths. And what we need to do as a society and as a church is come together and let our strengths work together instead of against each other to create a stronger union of marriage, of family, of society. And so God can bless us and prosper us. So don't be a man hater, and as a man, don't think that you should be beat down and emasculated and you have to surrender your masculinity and your manhood in order to comply with the societal norms that are being propagated today. Be the man that God created you to be. Be the man that the Bible says you're supposed to be. And do the right thing. In Jesus' name, God bless you.